Now, over on the east coast of the United States, the congressional lines in North Carolina are a little up in the air for 2020 because of a recent court ruling invalidating the Republican gerrymandered map. But Jason Butler is out running hard to win the second congressional district based on its current lines in a primary that will pit his support for Medicare for all and other pretty progressive positions against more centrist Democrats as he tries to take a shot at unseating the incumbent Republican. Jason has worked in social community action for a very long time, including something that especially caught my eye. He was the founder of an organization called Exploit No More, whose mission is to provide aftercare for underage victims of sexual exploitation and human trafficking. And so, Jason, you're in one of these places of a little bit of Netherland, meaning you actually don't know at this point where your district that you are going to run in, that you're planning on running, is actually going to be in terms of where the lines are going to be drawn. And that's because the whole map of North Carolina, the districts, has been thrown out by a court. And I assume now there's a lot of hemming and hawing and manipulations and behind the scenes maneuvering about what the lines are going to look like. Is that more or less right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like North Carolina is a classic case of some pretty severe gerrymandering, which has left Republicans with a 10-3 advantage in the Congress, even though it's a pretty 50-50 sort of state. And so those maps have been thrown out. The state legislature has come up with new maps, and they've actually pushed back the filing deadline for Congress. They're not letting anybody file right now for any congressional race in North Carolina until this is all settled.
Wow. So that could compress the whole way in which you run as a candidate because you may not know for a number of months, which obviously affects the constituents you might be appealing to and where you're actually going to be campaigning,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. So the district that I was sort of getting involved in, District 2, it was a 5-county area and very rural. And that has gotten all divided up in this new map, and District 2 now is the heart of Raleigh, North Carolina, basically one county and very urban and dense. And so it's a completely different demographic.
Mm. Well, at least if the district ends up in Raleigh, at least it'll be easier for you in terms of your family life since you live there with your wife and 3 children, right? So let's look on the
Yep.
positive side, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. My church is in Raleigh as well, as I'm also a pastor. So that I do have a presence there in this kind of justice realm. I'm known in Raleigh as someone who's an advocate for justice. So that could actually play in my favor.
Mm. So let's put that aside for now and just go and talk a little bit about the issues and your thinking about your running and how you want to present yourself and what you believe in, because whatever the district looks like, you're going to still be the same person. And one of the things I want to connect is the stuff that you have on your website, and it's partly connecting an experience you've had as co-founder of Exploit No More in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which, as you described, the mission of the organization is to provide aftercare for underage victims of sexual exploitation and human trafficking. And I'm focusing on human trafficking for a second. It's something I wrote an article about and did a lot of research about in the last year. And as a labor advocate, I'm very familiar with this. And in your other positions, you talk about creating an equitable free market economy. So here's my question. I'm not so sure that you can ever get rid of human trafficking in a free market economy. In other words, it's almost as if it's not a bug, it's a feature. So when I dug into the question of human trafficking, it really exists. The whole notion of exploiting human beings and trafficking them for both labor, for sexual exploitation, it exists because of the nature of the free market. Tell me where you agree, don't agree, what your view about that is.
Yeah, I think that so human trafficking is a global problem. And currently, if you look at the global statistics, there are more slaves right now, modern day slaves around the world than at any point in the history of humanity. So this is, it's not just a problem that we face. It is a global problem, and even more so globally because there's less regulations, there's more corruption. And so for me, this is probably across every culture, every nation is facing this. because I think it goes into something deeper of like our sort of brokenness as a people, and how I think this goes to really the fact that like we believe some people are more important than other people, and some people are less important, and therefore their lives can be abused and devalued and exploited. And so for me, like we need to really get at that. And I think like, and that goes into many problems that we face of like the immigration crisis right now in America, like where some people like are fundamentally believe that because of somebody's colors of skin, they're less human than somebody else. And so therefore we can mistreat them. So I think this really gets into this deep issue of how we value people, and why I'm such an advocate of equality and making sure that we create society where every single person has the same rights, privileges that every other person does.
Mm. So what triggered me to ask you about that, and I'm using trigger in not necessarily an emotional way in which it's usually used now, is the notion of free market. Meaning, I could see this, your position, which you just described as a very moral one, leading to an equitable economy. But the whole notion of the free market economy is at heart, in my view, and maybe I'm reflecting my own view as a democratic socialist, my own view as the free market economy is at heart the way in which exploitation and certainly human trafficking evolves.
hmm Yeah, I mean, I think you have a point there, and I think that we see that greed sort of runs rampant in a free market economy, and so that is the great danger of the free market is its susceptibility to greed, and so I think that's what we have to watch out for. But also, I'm a person like, so how do we find balance? How do we find a system that works for everybody? And so I think capitalism right now, as you say, is fundamentally broken. But I think that it still has values that are salvageable. And and so my wife grew up in Russia. She's Russian, and her experience coming out of really communism, which is not socialism, but it was also a very difficult experience socially, and left so many people impoverished because, again, like there was corruption there. So I think, like for me, what we need to work on is getting corruption out of the system, making sure that big corporations and billionaires can't just do whatever they want. Like we need accountability, and they need to do their fair share and pay their fair share. And so, like right now, we have a system, I believe, that's more like a corporateocracy, or whatever the word is for that. We don't even have like a true capitalism, and in my view. But to your point, I think there is a lot of corruption and a lot of greed that produces a lot of suffering, and human trafficking is one of those sufferings.
Hmm. And so you come at it, I assume the way you look at the economy comes from really your service as a pastor and someone who works within the religious community, within the community of religious folks, obviously in the community, in your own congregation. And so, is that what motivates you as someone who believes in God, I assume, and has a religious upbringing and a religious moral background? It seems like you explained it in those terms as opposed to sort of what I might do as a economic determinist.
hmm hmm Yeah, for sure. Like we're all shaped by our experiences and our have our deep knowledge and our expertise. And I come from a religious background, and so I own that and admit that. That doesn't. I think unfortunately right now in America we associate religion with sort of bigotry, and rightfully so. But I would say I'm open, and I'm open to all people and all faiths, and believe there's an intrinsic value and beauty in every single person. But yes, my experience is shaped by this belief that, as I understand God desires peace for every single person. God desires a flourishing life for every single person, and that we, as people, should go out and help produce a society and a system where every single person can flourish. And that involves the economy, it involves the job market, it involves nation state, and it involves the whole encompassing of the political. And for me, like this idea of the political in its truest self is the public negotiation of how a society cares for its citizens. And I feel like that's my responsibility in society, is to be part of that process of helping to create flourishing systems for every single person.
And I do like to talk to people of faith, especially someone like yourself who leads a congregation, and get their take and their reaction to what we often see, which is Republicans for sure, but certainly other people and some Democrats. But well, since you're running against a Republican and you are a Democrat, I am always amused, if I can use that word in a kind way, by Republicans who talk about embracing God and talk about how they're religious and how their faith guides them. And yet, every single thing they seem to do has nothing to do with what I think you would describe as what faith should lead you to, which is to support people, to look after people, love thy neighbor, and the other kinds of shorthands to that. That must kind of especially get to you as a person who leads a congregation, right? The contrast.
Mhm. Yeah, unfortunately, I think for a lot of evangelicals in America, the Republican Party has gerrymandered their faith, and a lot of evangelicals have traded their moral belief and their following this Jesus of justice for a conservative Supreme Court, and that's unfortunate. And for me, as a person of faith, I believe that we should seek the flourishing of every person. And pro-life, what it means to be pro-life, is not just an issue of a fetus, but it's about creating systems where every person have life. I mean, right now in America, we have children living in Flint, Michigan, in Michigan, who are testing supremely high for lead poisoning because we can't put clean pipes in their community. Like that's that's not pro-life right there. We're allowing that death to happen, and we can do better than that. And so on so many cases, I think that we've seen sort of the exploitation by the Republican Party of people of faith in order to pursue a politics of power.
Mm. In your positions, the material that you have in your website, one of the things that you mention at the end is the notion that you want to end damaging trade wars. And I remember certainly historically that North Carolina was at the center of these of the impact actually of so-called free trade deals. I'm not talking now about trade wars with China and the ones that are more in the news, but the way in which North Carolina was hurt by so-called free trade deals, especially because of the textile industry, which was very, very big in North Carolina, and lots of people worked in the textile industry. I'm wondering if you're finding that to be true within your district, whether folks who had worked potentially in the textile industry or generally speaking were affected by the closing down of those textile mills, and therefore you've seen economic hardship, both historically going back really 15, 20 years, especially to the passage of, since the passage of NAFTA to today.
Yeah, I mean, you can drive through towns in North Carolina and you can see where textile mills used to be. And I mean, it's whether it's textile or tobacco or corn, like you can see these places where people used to be in thriving communities, and now they're shell themselves, and their whole towns are just full of poverty. And unfortunately, that often disproportionately affects communities of color and people who worked in those mills. And so, yes, this is a problem. And I think fundamentally, we're going to have problems when corporations have such an influence over governmental policy. And so our governmental policy becomes whatever is best for the stockholders of X corporation. That's a problem. And we need to organize, we need to have organized people, organized workers that get a say in what's best for them and their lives. And we should be making trade policy based on what's good for our people, not what's good for the stockholders of a certain corporation. So I think that's fundamentally where I see a huge disconnect and why these problems are arising.
And so let me go to the next obvious question that you essentially telegraph, which is you talked about organized workers, and the labor movement has not been very strong in North Carolina. They did have some representation in those textile mills that I mentioned, but fundamentally, most of it was non-union, and North Carolina is a right to work state. I'm wondering, as you go along and talk to folks in your district, the people you meet in coffee shops or knock on people's doors, whether you're finding people's perceptions of unions changing in a specific community that you knew perhaps 5 or 6 years ago they weren't that open to unions, but the notion that economic desperation is driving people to support potentially unions. And I'm thinking especially within a rural community like North Carolina.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't see it. We don't see a lot of support or growing support for unions. I think that a lot of southern states have so demonized unions and connected it, unfortunately, again to a position of faith almost. And so that is, in some ways, the damaging effects of a faith gone sour. Is that now, like, unions are associated with communism or socialism, which is not true. Unions have been a backbone of workers in America since we got started, and so they're important. Unfortunately, they're not seen as important here, and I think a lot of what's happening is a lot of legislators won't stand up and fight for that because they're afraid that they won't get the votes, and so they're willing to just push that out and not stand up for unions. And I think that needs to change because I think unions fundamentally make a difference in the rights of workers and bring wages up, bring hours down, bring health benefits. So, I am all for unions and organizing workers.
The one thing that I might separate the point you made into two parts. One is that actually back in the beginning of the 20th century, socialists and communists were very involved in the labor movement in the United States. And in fact, they were some of the backbone of the leadership and of the great organizers that built the labor movement. Unfortunately, it was the Red Scare and the McCarthy era that drove those folks out of the labor movement. And so we live with that stain of McCarthyism throughout the country generally, but certainly in the labor movement, it's not as pronounced as it used to be. I mean, you could not literally say you are a democratic socialist in the labor movement 10 or 15 years ago. You would be blacklisted. Today, it's not as big of a threat to your ability to just be hired as an organizer or survive as a leader. But I do think you are right that the second part of what you said, you're totally right that the right wing and certainly, unfortunately, religious communities, and I mean the very extreme Christian right wingers who associate with the Republican Party and then turn that into anti-unionism. They turn that into being against unions.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of people ask me like, why are you a pastor and why are you running? And like there's this separation church and state, and like you should stay in your church and not involved in politics. But like what I say to that is like, look. Like when we begin to peel back the onion, we see how much the far right religious movement has connected and to movements that they don't approve of. So they've made issues religious. They've made unions religious. They've made immigration religious. They've made the Supreme Court religious. And so the only way I think that we're going to unwind ourselves from that sort of far right religion is to have people who can navigate that, people who understand that these have become religious issues for a lot of people. And how can we use religious language to pull people back and to help them see, wait a minute, this is not, unions aren't anti-God. They're just good business practices.